DeYoung is the Executive Director of Community Renewal Society, a historic civil rights organization in Chicago, working for systemic racial and economic justice through the unique programmatic combination of church-based community organizing, policy advocacy, and investigative journalism. CRS is a faith-based organization representing over 70 member congregations with deep roots and relations in the United Church of Christ and the broader Christian community, as well as a full embrace of interfaith and other community partners. DeYoung has served in academic and community work for over 30 years with the central concern for social justice, peace, and reconciliation. He earned degrees from the University of St. Thomas, Howard University, and Anderson University. He is an author and editor of 10 books on reconciliation, interfaith social justice, activism, multiracial congregations, racism, and cultural diversity. And the list goes on. He's created many books. I know Curtis for 7 years. He's been a great mentor to me and helped me in my own formation on my path towards racial reconciliation and justice. He's a great man, and I'm pleased to know him. And without further ado, here's Curtis DeYoung.
So before my current position, I was at a school called Bethel University in Twin Cities of Minnesota, and we created a department called Reconciliation Studies. Somewhat of an evangelical context, and so rather than naming it Peace and Justice Studies, because that caused people to quiver a little bit, we used Reconciliation Studies very much after sort of the South African model of reconciliation, which, so it's got a lot of peace and justice in it. And Drew and his wife Betsabe were students of mine, and I had a chance to get to know them. And so I'm very pleased to accept Drew's invitation to be here and to have a conversation tonight. Now, I should say right up front that Drew came up with the title of this event, A Theological Response to Gentrification. I don't know if it's ever been theologically responded to like that, but I think it creates a wonderful kind of conversation which I'm going to seek to give some perspective on, and then I hope that we together can sort of think through where we would head with this. What does it mean to think about gentrification, which is a serious challenge in many of our cities, and how we think about that theologically, how do we think about that strategically or politically, etc. So we can kind of talk about that. A couple other things I would just say about my own background. I'm ordained in the Church of God based out of Indiana, which is a part of the Holiness Movement. Much of my time in Minnesota, though, I went to Minnesota as a pastor in my denomination, but then after leaving it, being it was one of the few congregations of my denomination in Minneapolis, my wife and I started attending a Methodist congregation, and there we have been for about 25 years in Minneapolis. And I say there we are because I'm in Chicago, but my wife is still in Minneapolis in our transition time here. We're doing one of those modern phenomenon called commuter marriage, which is a little easier after 30 years of marriage and children grown than doing it at an earlier stage. But nonetheless, it's not what we were planning for this season of our life. So, I feel sort of a citizen of both places and connected. But so I've spent time in the Methodist Church, so I have some appreciation for what do they call it? The Book of Discipline, okay, and certain things like that, and the way bishops operate, and etc. So, and it's a one of the longest term multiracial congregations in the Twin Cities, and that was important. My MDiv comes from Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C., which is an HBCU, historic black college and university. I was there in the 1980s. And it dramatically changed my direction in life, and particularly the way I think. James Cone was a regular visitor and loved for Black liberation theology. There were kind of three people that were the kind of influence in the 80s. Your own Howard Thurman, which you lay great claim to, was also claimed by Howard University, as he was a professor there. Martin Luther King, again another shared connection, and then James Cone. And then there was sort of echoing Malcolm X influence, but we were also reading liberation theology from other parts of the world, because I was in seminary from 83 to 85, and a lot of work was emerging in various parts of Latin America and Asia and Africa, and so we read widely. But it was also at the time Jesse Jackson was running for president in 1984. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was coming to the U.S. along with Alan Busak and others to make the case against apartheid, and it was an interesting time to be at a seminary trying to think theologically about all of that. But I would say my Thurman is my primary influence on how I think about reconciliation. And so it's interesting to be here for the first time at Boston University. And of course, we had to sneak into Marsh Chapel so I could see where he stood when he preached and that, and enjoy a little bit of Thurman. And so yeah. So what I want to do today is kind of break this up sort of into three parts. One, let's try to define gentrification. And as I've shared with a few of you, like we academics like to do, I want to problematize some of the definitions a bit, which is what's kind of happening in the conversation. Then I want to take on this very interesting notion for those of you who, and I think a lot of seminaries these days read in post-colonial perspectives and thought, look at the first century congregations as a mix of colonized and colonizers, and ask, was that, because these were first Jewish congregations that then Romans and Greeks joined, was that gentrification or reconciliation? It's just a way to kind of think about the topic, to give it some kind of theological foundation. And then I think that we should have a conversation about what we need to do today with the real issues. So, having come from Chicago, it's like Boston and New York and DC, it's cities on the West Coast. Gentrification is in motion, and it's an interesting phenomenon. So let me just talk about what some of the folks who study gentrification and some of the commentators on it have said what gentrification is. So this comes from the Voorhees Center at the University of Illinois at Chicago. It's done some great work on gentrification in Chicago. Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change that results in the displacement of poorer households as wealthier households move in. It often includes a change from rental housing to home ownership or homes for sale. They switch from rental to sale. That could also be condominiums that were rental now being sold and owned. They ask, who's displaced by gentrification? How does it happen in this definition? Low-income households can no longer afford decreased rents and housing prices and are forced out. So they say there's two kinds of displacement. One is direct, where a landlord just raises the rent beyond what the tenant can afford, or indirect, when property values increase and people sell, and folks that look like them or come from their communities may no longer be able to afford the new reality. Who are the gentrifiers? Typically, gentrification in the U.S. is both income and race-based. So it's often wealthier white households moving into historic Latino or Black neighborhoods. So that's kind of how we think about it. So and we're going to problematize that just a little bit as we move into this and ask some questions about the kind of intersection of class and race around gentrification. So it's you know, I think this is all stuff we know. It's kind of a period of disinvestment in a community, often services. Well, to step back further, it's often a result of white flight initially. So whites move out, persons of color move in, the city provides less services, and communities are allowed to go into decline. And now we're at a season for the last 10, 20 some years where we see whites, middle class, upper class wanting to move back into the city. That's kind of simplistic, but that's sort of what it goes. So it's a process of displacement of poor residents to replace them with more middle and upper middle class. And often it has this race dynamic. So when people moved out to the suburbs, they took jobs with them, services, businesses, etc. A lot went with. And now you see the flip happening. Ferguson, just to mention it, is a great example of a city, of a community that was white, and then whites left, blacks moved in, and it's kind of flipped. And so there's a lot of suburbs now that are becoming like we used to think of the inner city. It's all sort of interconnected. Yeah, just a couple other things about the way people talk about this. So there was this article written about gentrification, and these are some cultural commentators and some scholars on this saying. So one says, it's when developers come in and systematically push people out of a neighborhood that's mostly poor ethnic minorities. Another person says, gentrification starts even before the developers, with the changing of the cultural identity of a neighborhood, when artists, writers, and people like that move into these neighborhoods, and their presence starts to create a process that moves into gentrification. So that's their opinion. Another person says, no, gentrification starts with government, who's always trying to figure out ways to, now in this reality today, to drive resources back into the city. So it might be a new subway put to this neighborhood, or services are improved, there's some development, some new buildings coming up, there might be tax incentives for this to happen. And then they add the caveat, while all this development is happening, government turns a blind eye to how this has a domino effect on displacing people that already live there. So, now, as I said, the popular media, and often the way we talk about gentrification, is depicted as a process where middle class, upper class whites move in and either integrate neighborhoods and eventually displace persons of color. And that's how it works in a lot of places. Now, what some studies are showing is that it's not quite as simple as that. That typically it's not an all-black neighborhood that's being gentrified. In fact, in Chicago, some studies, because we're a highly segregated city, and the south side and the west side is where a majority, and if blacks move to the suburbs, it's the suburbs around those areas. And that's a history of intentional segregation in the city through redlining and restrictive covenants to keep certain areas white. And Latinos are a little bit more dispersed, but still fairly segregated into certain communities. So they're saying, as they look at Chicago, if the neighborhood is over 40% black, it will probably not gentrify. And we'll kind of move on that in a little bit. But so it says gentrifiers prefer neighborhoods that already have a white presence of some sort there to kind of join. And they're least attracted to black neighborhoods, and they see Asian and Latino neighborhoods as kind of middle options, kind of based on the racial stereotypes in the location about Asians or Latinos. So if it's a fairly positive view, then they're more gentrified. If it's a negative view, then it fits kind of in the category with African Americans. But that was like, I was like, okay, it's starting to make this not quite as simple. Now, the question is there black gentrification? Is there Latino gentrification, where middle and upper middle class African Americans and Latinos move into communities and become a part of that same process? Many of the scholars say no. What is happening is, because, okay, we have a community called Bronzeville, which would be kind of the Harlem of Chicago, historic black neighborhood, the cultural center of African Americans, that has a number of, large sort of homes that have been sitting empty that now middle class and African Americans, upper class African Americans with resources are buying and fixing up. And so they're saying that yes, African Americans are moving into these communities, but what's not happening is that there are not new grocery stores emerging, there's not coffee shops coming in, boutiques, in the same way you think about kind of the business side of gentrification. So they say, in theory, black gentrification could happen in theory because it's an economically driven reality, but it never seems to quite happen, at least in Chicago. And there, this is what they say, scholars who are working on this, is that retailers still have an aversion, it's maybe a strong word, but an aversion to black consumers. So then they use this statement, even if they have the green, they're still black. And seeing a similar kind of reality in some Latino neighborhoods. So that's, again, it's kind of like, wow, this is kind of confusing it a little bit more. So you kind of have the economics of gentrification take place in the people who live there, but not the development and all of that tends to go with that. So what you really have happening is more like what happened under segregation, where you had mixed incomes of all one race. And so in some ways, African American folks are moving back into their cultural home neighborhoods and developing mixed income neighborhoods. So it's in some ways, it's a good community development kind of thing, but it's still a black neighborhood, so it doesn't have that shift. Now, there are also now places, the neighborhood that has been written about is in LA, Lincoln Heights, where Latinos are moving back into historic Latino neighborhoods. This is happening in other places around the country as well. And so in many cases, that's because people want to live back home, their home neighborhood where they came up. And it's an ability to bring their college education, their skills, and their greater incomes back into the community to redevelop the community. So that's the intention. And I think it's a lot true in this case of African American communities. So, and in fact, they're not really interested in suburban style living. They like a community where there's street vendors out, something that, things that a lot of the cultural sort of pieces, whether it be artwork or the way the community operates culturally. And so they see this happening. Now, the downside is, and this is again the gentrification sort of question, is that by having middle class folks moving in, rents are starting to increase now, and home values are going up, even though it's been a Latino middle class moving into a Latino neighborhood. And now the developers are starting to look at these neighborhoods as the next places to gentrify. So we're going to have to come back to this as we talk about how do you deal with this, because neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, need to be developed. We can't have these areas that are, what do they call that, where there's no grocery stores? I'm trying to find food deserts. Thank you. And that's, of course, the discussion around Whole Foods, which I see has come to Jamaica Plain, is in Detroit now, in one of the most challenging neighborhoods in Detroit, and now is coming to a similar neighborhood in Chicago. And Whole Foods, again, and these particular experiments are trying to fit in with the neighborhood to some degree. They're trying to look at how things are priced, that they're arranged. In Detroit, they're even doing cooking classes and stuff in the community. So there's a lot of good in what's happening, but it's still different than the groceries that are now going out of business that used to be places where people socialized and connected and had community and cultural value. So there's a tension. And so part of where I want to problematize this is that we often say that gentrification is bad. And if it displaces people, it is. And that's what gentrification is. But how do we develop communities in ways that doesn't displace people? What are the things that we can think about doing that keep that in place? So that's going to be part of it as we move toward trying to think this through. What are the things we do politically as the church in neighborhoods, etc. Last thing I'll just say was there was a piece written about Roxbury, which I understand is people see as one of the next places that could be gentrified here in Boston. And they did a comparison to what's happened on the South End, and that's right next to Roxbury, is that right? Mm-hmm. So if the same thing happens in Roxbury, in the next 20 years, this is what would happen to Roxbury if there's not anything done to address this according to their stats. They say if it's the similar income mix, let me just get this, there we go. Roxbury could see a giant swing in population, losing 5,000 low-income households and gaining 5,200 upper-income households. So that's quite a flip economically. And the way that would play out, and this is middle-income population would actually represent less than 20% of the community in that flip. So it's gone to a really upscale kind of community. And so over the next 20 years, it just what's been normally happens that can flip. The racial flip is just as dramatic. A post-gentrification Roxbury could lose almost 10,000 African American and Latino households and gain about 8,100 white households. Roxbury would be a majority white neighborhood in 20 years if this process happens. That's what they're looking at. So finally, the last question, we're going to come back to this too, but can white urbanites be ethical gentrifiers? That's what this one article starts off with. And so can white people come into communities of color in a way that doesn't disrupt the community and not cause gentrification? So which I think is a legitimate question for us to ask, because especially if we're passionate about issues of reconciliation and in congregations being multiracial, we would not be adverse to multiracial, multicultural communities per se, but it's what gets lost in the process that we want to think about. So how can that happen? And how can a community keep its cultural history and its affordable rents, but still thrive economically? And as this article writes, and expect to have its trash get picked up once a week, like should be happening in all communities. So that kind of piece. So let's just flip for a minute and go to the first century congregations that Paul writes about and Acts writes about. Again, so this is based on the way those congregations are described in Acts and in Paul's writings. And put that into sort of the context of the day and see if we can gather any insights. Okay? So, like I said, I didn't find any other theological responses to gentrification. So we're sort of experimenting here and kind of creating, because we do need a theological response to gentrification. It's out of control. And so where do we need to end up on that as people of faith, people who think theologically? So the first century, as you know from your courses and your study, was in Palestine and in the enclaves of Jewish people around the Roman Empire. It was a very hostile environment for Jewish folks in the first century. Obviously in Palestine you're under occupation, and so you're experiencing all the dynamics of occupation and crucifixions as sort of a regular occasion, kind of like lynchings in our country is a way to kind of keep people subjugated and keep people in fear. But even in the broader sort of Roman Empire and the various cities, Jews often lived in segregated communities, and there was a lot of hostility and bigotry. You see it in the writings of people at the time, in some of the derogatory comments and the way they talked about Jewish people, both religiously and ethnically, which were sort of combined. So they're experiencing bias and the violent oppression of Rome, and they are terrorized people in many ways. So you gotta go, so how did this happen, that all at once you have these, churches, or Jews and Gentiles come together, and, this, given the context, the colonial context, these are colonized people with all of the effects of colonization, I'm sure, being experienced by folks. So the word reconcile, I'm going to say, is it reconciliation or gentrification? I'm going to make the case that it's reconciliation, and that we can learn from this context to apply to our reality of gentrification in communities. But the English word reconciliation comes from a few different Greek words used for reconciliation that basically mean to change or to exchange, to effect a change. And I like South African theologian John de Gruchy, the way he defines this word. He says it's to exchange places with the other person, if you're reconciling the other group. And that would then, and then you become in solidarity with, solidarity with, because of this exchange of places, experiences, locations. So that's, reconciliation has a pretty deep meaning, and it's biblical meaning. So for Paul or any of the early disciples who were using this language of reconciliation, they were speaking of it as a colonized person. The new studies on Paul were really helpful for me as I tried to think about, right, what did the first century Jewish writers, most of them Jewish writers of the New Testament, and Paul in particular, mean when they use the word reconciliation, because it gets used so many ways in our day. And I said, you first have to understand that these were colonized people. People like to say, oh, Paul, he had Roman citizenship. Well, many of you who are persons of color in this room have U.S. citizenship. And I think you would still say that you experience much of the brunt of the hostility of racism. Women are U.S. citizens in our country, but they experience it. So I think Paul experienced much of what, not most, and it seems that his Roman citizenship basically got him beheaded instead of crucified in the end. And then Paul never mentions that he's a Roman citizen. That's only mentioned in Acts. It's never mentioned in any of his own writings. It didn't have a lot of meaning to him, it seems. But where he talks a lot about his own Jewish identity and what that means as he's now embracing Christ. So I just put that context around. I said, I need to figure this out. And that these congregations began as Jewish congregations. In most cases, went first to the Jews and then to the Greeks and the Romans, and there's a lot of good work on that that you can see. So I was trying to understand it. So here's my take on this. So you have, it begins with this crucifixion and resurrection event of Jesus. This is what launches these early congregations. So I want to use a little language as kind of current language as well, where it kind of echoes from current language. But Jesus is crucified by Rome, and he's resurrected against Rome by God. So the Romans have the power to crucify him as a colonized person. God overturns the decision of Rome and resurrects Jesus. Now, if you think of that as Jesus as a Jew, and it was clear, the King of the Jews in 3 languages, clearly that he's being crucified almost as a representative of Jews. Many Jews were crucified, but not many got this kind of title, King of the Jews and stuff. So that when people who were Jewish observed Jesus alive, experienced the resurrection, heard about this, they saw that Jewish lives matter. That the resurrection is a statement that Jewish lives matter. Oppressed people's lives matter. Colonized people's lives matter. Because God stepped in and reversed what Rome was doing. So as I look at this as a person who's done a lot of thinking and work around reconciliation, I say this kind of set off this moment of healing for Jewish folks who embraced this story, this reality, this experience. And you see it in the way that, particularly the writings of Paul, the language used for Caesar, Son of God, Lord, Redeemer, Savior, Liberator, God, is now given to Jesus. So there's this switch that's taking place. People are moving from having, as colonized people, and I'll get to the colonizer in a minute, but the colonized folks have been forced to this identity, to take their identity from Rome, and it's been forced upon them. And now this is showing that through this connection with God, this is flipping, this is switching. And so when Paul says, when he's writing about his own experience, he's writing in 2 Corinthians 5, he says, we regard no one from a human point of view anymore. We regard no one from the view of the colonizer anymore. We now view from this new perspective. So my case is that what happens is that in these Jewish congregations, in these communities, is that they become these laboratories of healing. And if you read and a lot of you have read post-colonials, my primary reading of post-colonials, so the early ones like Fanon and Mimi and others, and you see talk about the effects of colonization, both the colonizers, which we're going to get to in a minute, and the colonized. But one of the things that they talk about, which W. Du Bois talks about, and many others, is double consciousness occurs. Sometimes you embrace the perspective of the colonizer for your own self-identity. And Fanon and some of the others talk, and Mimi talk about the effects on them as black people was that they wanted to be white, subconsciously, but to be embraced. And that's humanity and whiteness became one. This gets flipped through the resurrection of Christ, who says that Jewish lives matter, that by being crucified by Rome and now raised by God, Jewish lives matter. And I think that's what's happening in these Jewish congregations. These people are regaining a full sense of themselves as human beings, as Jews, created in the image of God, and being able to cast aside this identity, and they create a decolonized identity now. So that's what I want to put forward to what's happening in these Jewish congregations. For those of you who just came in, where we did a piece on gentrification to talk about what it's doing. Now we're taking a look at the early congregations and asking the question, how these Jewish congregations become congregations with Romans and Greeks in them. Was that gentrification or reconciliation? And I'm trying to make the case that it's reconciliation, and then I want to apply that back to current communities, and then we'll see where we go from there. But that's kind of what I'm trying to do. So I want to set the case is that we have these Jewish congregations that are laboratories for healing, where the language is being exchanged, the language of Caesar, as I said, Son of God, Lord, Redeemer, etc., is now being given to Christ. So it's like a literal identity kind of switch that's taking place, even in the language about who they are as a community. So if that's where the early church stayed, that would be an amazing story. That through the death and resurrection of Jesus, a people who had been colonized regain a sense of themselves as human beings, as children of God, created in the image of God, and moving forward. But what's so radical about this story is that once healed, and of course it's an ongoing process as people are coming in, they begin to look at the colonizer and say maybe they can be healed too. Maybe. And so you begin to see this, and of course the first kind of individual example you see this take place is the engagement between Peter and Cornelius. And I want to thank Duke Professor Willie Jennings and his recent book for drawing this to my attention. And what we see happening there is this very interesting encounter from a Roman centurion whose job it is to keep the colonial order in place. And this member of the colonized, Peter, in this interaction. And of course, we know the story is that and Cornelius embraces faith, etc. But the little piece right at the end that Willie Jennings draws attention to is that he says the Roman invited Peter to stay in his home many days. So it wasn't just this kind of one-time event. Peter hung out for a while at the house. Again, we're in first century, and for Peter that was significant because in Middle Eastern culture, home was the center, as it is in a lot of cultures. So if you're invited to stay in someone's home, that's a serious kind of invitation to a almost familial relationship. But for Cornelius, the transformation for him is that he could no longer, now that he has embraced Peter as like a family member, like his brother in Christ, he can't go back out on the job and beat up Jewish people and oppress Jewish people. We don't know the rest of the story on Cornelius, but he had to change his behavior. Then, I would assume as he grew in his faith, he had to then be questioning the system that he was working for. And this may have eventually cost Cornelius his employment. They may start asking too many questions. He may have not even been able to feel like he could be representative of that. So that's what's sort of starting to happen. But it becomes even more dramatic is that when these churches, these small congregations, they're in people's homes, these are all house churches mostly. Cornelius is an individual example, but what begins to happen is they begin to invite in Greeks and Romans into homes. And so they're coming into the homes of Jewish people. And again, if you understand the kind of communal culture, the kind of radical hospitality that's a part of Middle Eastern culture, it's a part of actually many cultures around the world and in the States, but it's that kind of culture that when you come into the home, if you're invited into someone's home, you are embraced. As an equal, you're embraced, you're forgiven. If there's any kind of animosity that's there, you're embraced as family. And so when you begin to see in the midst again of this colonial empire of Rome, you have colonized and colonizers together, and you see dominant culture, Greeks and Romans, now coming in to this fellowship. It's amazing just to think about that they're now together. So what happens when you come into a church like this? And I want to make the cases. I think that the primary biblical model, and I use this analysis when we look at how multiracial congregations should operate as well. But the primary biblical model of congregations was one where members of an oppressed community, Jewish congregations, welcomed people from privileged dominant culture into their congregations. That's the primary biblical model of what we might call a multicultural, multiracial congregation, was that kind of a model. So we see people coming into these home-based congregations. They're exchanging places, which was our definition of reconciliation from the Grushi. And so Romans and Greeks are being reconciled with Jews who were oppressed. And their privileged perspectives and positions had to be discarded. So can you imagine, I'm a white male, and I go and I want to integrate an African American congregation, and I show up on a Sunday, and they say, you're welcome here, but you got to leave your white privilege at the door if you're going to come in here. I mean, that's what's happening. And these are people whose lives could have, they're almost at risk to invite folks in. But also what happened to the Romans and Greeks is they let go of privilege to be in these relationships. In some sense, empire privileges ceased to exist in these early congregations. In society, Jews were socially beneath Greeks and Romans. In the church, Jews were in leadership. I've scanned most of the New Testament looking at the congregations that are noted, and in every case that I can identify who's in leadership, it's Jewish folks in leadership in the first generation. They will mentor folks up from Greek community and others to be leaders in following generations. But so there's like a status inversion, there's a switch, there's a flip that's taking place when you are used to being dominant in society come into the church. and now you're under. And it's not kind of like some way, oh, we need to flip this to do this to you because you've done this to us. No, it's about, if you're going to learn about what it means to be a part of an oppressed or marginalized community, then you need to sit and be under the leadership and be mentored and experience that. Now, for Romans and Greeks, when they joined these congregations, they became identified with the Jewish community. So they were socially stigmatized. And that certainly affected their journey in life after that. By joining this faith community, that celebrated faith in a colonized, crucified Christ. And you're a Roman or Greek. That's quite that just alters your life. That has life-altering repercussions. So anyway, I wanted to just sort of, because I think there's some things that we can see how. The last thing I'll just say about this is that as I noticed that there was, Paul always was mentoring folks. So he always has like an entourage with him serving in these congregations. And quite often there's about half of the group are Jews and the other half are Greeks, probably some Romans. And he's mentoring. And so if you are like in the dominant culture and you're a part of this, you're being mentored by Paul alongside with some other Jews. You're being mentored by Paul as though you were Jewish. And so let me just give an illustration of this to try to make it come home. So when I went to Howard University to divinity school, I was also working in a local church in DC that was African American and Jamaican. So it's one thing to be in that classroom and figuring this stuff out academically. It's another thing you have to kind of live out this reality. So early in my time there, the associate pastor who was over the interns said, I want you to go and pray with this family, who will then be coming to the church for a funeral service. I said his congregation was 100% black. I was the only white intern. And so on my way over, I started to have a little whiteness attack and go, okay, I'm a white person and I'm going into this family's home who I've not met, who are African American, and that could be problematic. They're going to ask, why am I here? They're going to question this, all that stuff. You know what? My race meant nothing in that moment because a pastor came to pray with them before the funeral. That's what was being experienced. Secondly, the pastors of the church were not going to switch it up for me. It's kind of like, oh, well, he's our white intern, so we can't send him to the black families because, No, you're just going to do just like everyone else. We're not doing anything different for you. And you're going to learn about experience within this particular congregation by just going through the hoops like everyone else. Now, my denomination, Church of God, this is a congregation, Church of God, is about 20% African American. And there's a separate convention due to the kind of history for the African American church. And so because through the course of time with this church and some other churches, I was mentored by African American leadership, I was invited to preach at the Black Church Convention. Now normally, they had a kind of a slot on Friday evening for the white speaker who would come and speak, usually a denominational official, to show the connection. But when it was my turn, I had to, like every other young preacher, I had to preach in the morning. There was no special treatment. So this is what's happening here. I'm just trying to illustrate this, that is that there are these opportunities to mentor. Now, let's flip this. How do what we hear happening in these congregations apply to what needs to happen in communities? And particularly as whites move in to communities of color, And some white folks move into communities of color, not because they're being gentrified, but because they want to live in a context that's diverse, but then they also become a part of what causes the gentrification. So it's a really interesting scenario. So what are we hearing that perhaps, so this is one of the applications that the white folks need to know or need to be doing as they come in the community? And that's a question for anyone to respond to. Then I'm going to take some questions, and then we're going to talk even more about what we do. But I want to grab this while it's fresh. Yes.
So I live in Jamaica Plain, and I live about, and I've been there for 8 years, and I live maybe like 6 blocks from Whole Foods, so which used to be Hilo, right? I mean, so I've been kind of really aware of like what has happened in my neighborhood, like in this conversation, and you know, I think that JP has a really vibrant housing community that's talking about housing and the neighborhood development organization. And I think that just sort of listening to what they are advising and the decisions that they're making around making sure that there is affordable housing in JP, shopping locally, not just like new locals, but old locals, being aware of that. So I'm just telling you things that like, those are the things that like I've learned and tried to kind of be aware of, like who's telling me how to be a good neighbor. Am I supporting Hyde Square Task Force? Am I supporting, you know, and Whole Foods is too, and interesting, right? Like they're giving proceeds, you know, in these kind of ways. But I mean, I think kind of asking where you're spending your money when you're in your neighborhood is at least one way, and kind of like listening to folks who've been there and who've been involved in the work long time, but you know, how can you be a partner in a way that that's aware of what's happening.
Right. So listening, going in with a sense of humility, like this is a neighborhood that's been here a long time, it's got a history and culture, and let me find who the people are who can tell me the stories of this community. Let me, you know, shop, let me engage locally, let me become a part of this community. I think are kind of the sense that we hear what happened. And if you think about these early congregations, they were, like I said, Jewish congregations, and then, you know, a few Gentiles would come into the mix, Greeks, Romans, whatever, who had never been in that context before. This is where I use this talking about multiracial congregations. One of the things I find in multiracial congregations, and one of their issues is that most of the persons of color, in most cases, who are in a multiracial congregation, this is not their first experience with white people, or being in white contexts, or even being in white churches. But for a lot of the white folks, and they're doing it for good intentions, but this is kind of their first experience, and so they jump to certain assumptions. So my Methodist church back in Minnesota, as you know, Methodist, the bishop appoints. So even though the congregation was multiracial that I attended, all the pastors have been white until maybe 10 years ago. They finally appointed an African American pastor to the congregation. They had associate pastors, but the senior pastor now finally appointed. And, you know, folks going like, why does he holler all the time when he preaches? And I go, he's not hollering. Why does he, and they were talking, all the stuff they were talking about was cultural. Dress, wants to be called Pastor Oglesby rather than by his first name. These are cultural pieces that come out of, he was raised in a very traditional African-American Methodist church in Chicago. But because of the lack of experience, or not asking questions, or not kind of having someone sort of school you, so the fact that I served in African American congregations, went to Howard University, I learned some stuff along the way, so it wasn't a surprise, and that's why I knew he wasn't hollering, because I've been in churches that are more vibrant in that way in the preaching, and that he had actually toned it down, knowing that he was in a white church. But it's because it just seemed, from their context, but people genuinely wanted to be in this multicultural church because they felt that's what the gospel was calling them to. But it's how do we equip, so bring that back to the neighborhoods, how do we preserve neighborhoods and all their culture and stuff, but at the same time bring in amenities, and even white people can come in, but how do they come in? So I think your point is really well taken. Yes?
I think another important thing that I've observed with evangelical friends of mine in LA who have moved into the inner city for racial reconciliation is that they move into a neighborhood and they kind of choose like a designated area that they'll all live within,
Right.
and invest in and everything until they have children.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the neighborhood is not, safe enough, or the schools aren't good enough. And so either they have their children then move, put them in private school, so then really they're not experiencing the full experience of being families in that neighborhood. Or they move. That's when they move. All of a sudden racial reconciliation did not see this.
Right. For their children, especially as they get closer to dating age, you see that happen even more. Because you think about who are the potential spouses, or this could go somewhere, and so so that's also, and that's again both for race and economic reasons. So it's problematic, all of this, as we were saying earlier. So what are some questions or comments you have as we kind of process in this, thinking about this?
I have thoughts.
Yeah, please, yeah.
I just think about, because gentrification involves so many people, right? And so it's not, doesn't assume that it's going to be a lot of people that are conscientious about the impact to different people and stuff. So I think of, you raising the point about, as churches. So I do think there's to think about, kind of as a Christian identified person and being part of a community, like that shares that identity. The church having an activist role seems very important, because otherwise there's a lot of forces that are just gonna kind of play out, that are, and so, just the importance of thinking ecclesiologically about it.
Right.
Which I hadn't thought about, because I kind of almost think, so many people aren't gonna care. It's not gonna be a justice issue for them. They're gonna want the fancier coffee, or they're gonna want, the whatever bookstore or something.
Right.
So who will, and you have a collective of people.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when we think about churches moving in to communities that are gentrifying. It's an interesting, I hadn't really thought about this until you kind of were starting to push that a little bit, but one thing you do find are, and I'm a huge proponent of multiracial churches, but because I went to HBU seminary, I see the reality of racism still existing and why we have churches that are African American, Latino, or Asian, whatever. There's a huge value in until we have no more racism, which may not happen anytime soon. There's going to be a need for the prophetic voice and the cultural comfort and the place where you don't have to deal with racism and all the things that churches offer. But what happens sometimes you see in these communities is a new multiracial congregation come in with the gentrifiers. Again, with good intentions, the idea to kind of bridge the new white people that are moving in and the community folks that are there. But unless that's done in relationship with the other congregations that are there, and why aren't you already joining the congregations that are already there? There's some questions that need to be asked about that. And I'm not against starting new churches in places where there's kind of these new realities emerging, but it's kind of like, let's be honest about it, and let's do this in a way that has some authenticity to it. And you know, these communities are being gentrified. I have a lot of churches that are now struggling because people have been displaced out of their communities. And so might that be a good place to settle in and see what can happen, you know? And if you're worried about your children, well, you'll meet some church folk, you know, who share your views, even though they may be racially different than you. And so you shouldn't be worried, at least in the church. I mean, there's some ways that could be helpful, I would think. But often it's, you know, the churches in the community get smaller and smaller and less resource. And then the new congregations come in, just like the coffee shops and the boutiques and the new groceries and stuff. And so I just think we have to be kind of honest and transparent and critique this, and not say it's all bad, because like I said at the outset, the worst thing we can do is to say that poor communities don't deserve being developed, upgraded. But how do they actually get to stick around and enjoy that development and be also a part of that improvement and benefit from it? So that's one of the challenges. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, having done this, like I was part of a potential church plant moving into a, you know, gentrifying neighborhood and experience a lot of that. It's kind of the whole sense of, yes, a neighborhood deserves development, but what does it mean to advocate for or encourage development on its own cultural terms?
Right.
That part of the reason why, or a big part of the reason why, you know, neighborhoods are poor is because of active disinvestment, active oppression on the part of the dominant culture that says that the only way that this neighborhood can develop is if colonizers come in and start reshaping it in our own image. And that's how it gets. And so what does it mean to actually kind of like de-center that thought? Because part of what growing up white means is that you don't actually often come up against other cultures because the structure kind of prevents that. But yeah, like a vision for a neighborhood developing on its own historical and cultural terms, and what would that actually look like? Bigger economic realities and all that. But
no, that's a very good point. And that's what some of the scholars who write about gentrification say. The bigger issue is that there are neighborhoods that are economically poor, that are, you know, gentrification is sort of what's happening as a result of a previous problem. And so it's like, maybe we address more of the root of the issue and think creatively from that place, that starting point. That's good. Yes?
I'm thinking as you make these points, I'm thinking about the fact that also in the 1980s, early 1990s, we did a lot of urban ministries. Targeting this intersection of race, economics, gender, and the intersectionality. And somehow we didn't, I feel, being part of that pastoral ministry, the inner cities mainly, that we did not identify a good model. Even if we were from the communities, we were trained in places like this, but we were not able to acquire the necessary tools to really come up with something different. So we don't talk in seminaries anymore about urban ministries, and I feel part of it has to do with the fact that we never really identified an alternative that was a viable, you know, difference within. I mean, we did a lot in the United Methodist Church. We invested a lot of time, energy, and resources into this whole thing of shalom zones, you know, out of the LA conflict. So you know, I'm still trying to figure out what, definitely the big question is exactly what will be an alternative to. And it will be difficult to figure it out. It's almost like difficult to figure it out because of Christianity itself is a colonizing enterprise. So
see, it wasn't originally, as we look at the first century, it was an anti-colonial movement in a sense, and it was decolonizing folks. We don't have enough post-biblical kind of material, because we know it eventually basically became a Gentile church. So maybe it did eventually get gentrified in that sense, or maybe it's just the numbers, of where the church was going. But obviously its headquarters end up in Rome, and which is an interesting story in itself. But you think about that. So, but what's really interesting about this first century church is that the center of the church are the people who have been marginalized and oppressed. So the frame for thinking about ministry. So as you talk about urban ministry, I remember after I went to seminary at Howard, I grew up in the white church in suburbs, and then I find myself at a church in Harlem, and I discover this other kinds of realities, and I end up at Howard Seminary. And then after that, I remember going back to these same urban ministry conversations and realizing that the frame was white, and persons of color were being set inside this frame as a part of the conversation, but not the creators of the frame. And I kept asking, because all the experts they bring in on urban ministries conversations were white, so I'm going, I'd be an occasional person of color voice. I said, are you not connecting with the historic African American church that's been here forever in the cities? I mean, it's not called urban ministry, it's just called ministry. But that, so is that in conversation? And so I do think that's part of the challenge, is that a lot of what we've created still has the colonial frame kind of around it. And so, in our seminaries, in most of our denominations, that's still a reality. And then, and then the effects of colonization, even in communities of color, affects even that at some point too, among colonies. So yeah, that's a huge challenge. Yes?
Yeah, before I moved to Boston, I worked at a church in San Antonio that was a Hispanic church. I was like one of a handful of white people there. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about the demographics of the church. And so it's in the west side of San Antonio, which is the historically lower socioeconomic neighborhood. But it's also a church plant from the north side. Or it's not a church plant from the north side. We do satellite churches. So it's the satellite from the north side. And so it's a church of 14,000.
Right.
But our satellite has like 600 people. But I found, in thinking about this, an interesting thing was that a lot of the members, the people there, don't live within, 10, 15 miles of the church, which, I mean, San Antonio is very large.
Right.
Don't live on the west side.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it's kind of a question of the people who don't also live in the neighborhood but grew up with similar experiences or grew up in the context, coming now from outside to be in the neighborhood and yet not live in the neighborhood because, like you were saying, they have children.
Right.
Or somebody said they have children. And so I don't know, just really I was thinking about the idea of gentrification and the dimensions between class and race. Because of the struggle that I went through with them versus their relationship with the main church, versus when they would want to have Hispanic Church Day, church-wide Hispanic whatever. Right. But I mean, the West Side Hispanic people do not get along with the North Side Hispanic people because they're from Monterrey and elite or whatever. But that was what I had heard from them, and so I don't know, I guess I was just thinking about how the people who grew up in that context no longer live there, but then come in, and what kind of dynamic that creates for a community or a church body.
Yeah, see, the realities are challenging. So there's class, and you're talking the Latino community, there's culture, community of origin, et cetera. But that's true in any community. There's not a monolithic anything, really. But that adds to the complexity of the discussion, the conversation. Even we move back to community. That's why the question is, when black middle class or Latino middle class, upper class, move back, but it's into a neighborhood of the same cultural origin, but it's middle class people coming in. Is that gentrification or is that community development? Enhanced community, it could be either way. It really depends on how it plays out. It's again, even with whites move in to poorer communities, even if they're communities of color, it doesn't have to prompt gentrification. But it usually does, because we've got these outside forces called developers and governments and people making agreements and all that stuff. So, you know, what communities have to do, and then it's kind of an unfair question to ask or challenge under-resourced communities to take on these over-resourced giants that are coming in and developing them. It's a really interesting kind of conversation. A couple of things that have been mentioned as just to kind of step us back into the gentrification conversation of communities is that what you have to do is do a lot of building of housing. If you're building new housing in an area, that's middle income. So you secure sort of a middle income. Because a lot of times developers will come in, especially if there's empty land or they can tear down spaces, they'll build these high rises, high end, and in kind of one fell swoop, you've got all these high income people coming into the community and radically changing the reality that's happening. And then you've got to find ways to help long-term residents stay. So it could be around freezing the property taxes so that property taxes don't go up as other values go up. You particularly need to help seniors who are homeowners, because once your whole house price goes up and you're a senior, you want to sell, and you should be able to make money on your house. But then you're probably going to sell to someone who's coming in and gentrifying the community. So, you know, let's find ways to incentivize seniors to be able to stay and not have, you know, stay longer at least, or, you know, help with that. Again, I said kind of one of the things they say is prohibit these large-scale luxury developments that happen in at-risk communities. And just do whatever you can to create ways to help folks at the community. Fair housing kinds of policies. The one thing they mentioned is a stabilization voucher, so you give housing vouchers to help long-term residents be able to stay as gentrification begins to occur. So it's these kind of creative methods. And then I think, you know, because I mixed the metaphors by taking community and church, so it's my fault that we are talking about both at the same time. But I also think it raises the awareness is that congregations and churches and neighborhoods can play a role in this and actually could be an important part of this sort of creative process. You know, and just, what else? I left this last part sort of, because I didn't come in to prescribe for Boston or for you how this should happen, but to create thinking and have us talk about it. And so I'm curious what else is sort of bubbling up in your mind.
Yeah, I guess what I'm really, I just moved from Detroit, actually, and huge issue. I mean, you're seeing white flight happening in huge numbers, and now a resurgence of young professionals moving back into the downtown area. And this story of large corporations seeing these swaths of land that can be bulldozed and changed into something else. It's really conflicting, because what you see is, what I've seen there has been small neighborhoods not having the ability to do anything against these larger corporations. And so there were a few instances where, like, the neighborhood I was living in, Springwells Village, and neighboring Hamtramck and E-Course were able to kind of bond together. And that kind of created this, like, Detroit pride that I think is pretty filling. And I was wondering, I guess, is that something that, I'm really curious about how that actually is created. Because oftentimes those systems can seem so large. You got the Illiches who own half of Detroit. And so how are you able to work against that? Because from an Illich, from somebody who has the money to be able to do these things, it's more profitable to have these high income housing going into these places.
Right.
But community wise, it's such a kill it, you know, and it can, like you said, just push people out. And so what small grassroots organizations, is there examples and things like that that we could look at and understand?
Sure. I think this is really sort of cutting edge stuff. I mean, gentrification has been going on for a while, and we've just kind of thought it was what happens. It's cycles, you know, you think, okay, this is how it happens. The idea of actually thinking about challenging it is a newer, it's been happening in certain communities. So I mean, you definitely need folks trained in community organizing and get some good policy people working with you, even if they're not from your community. You can partner with various organizations because you're going to have to deal with the powers that be, in both in the political system of your city as well as in the business community. And those two groups often are quite aligned. And you're going to have to, you may have to move into protest or something to draw attention. So that's where you really need the kind of community organizing. But people have to get trained in those skills. So the organization I the executive director of Chicago, we haven't taken on this issue presently. In the past, when they were tearing down the projects, you know, which is what happened, they got replaced, and those folks got displaced to the suburbs. And so we have a number of very poor suburbs now, because that's where, you know, people who were living on public assistance went, but lost all their stuff. So at the time, there was an attempt to challenge it, and sometimes you don't win these battles, but that's what you need. And if you have a church-based group of organizers, then you also can, are faith-based, you can position yourselves as the moral voice on this and challenge it. But it takes some way of organizing that. And a lot of times people in communities that are suffering are just trying to survive and make it from day to day. Some people working a couple of jobs and stuff. And so you do need partnerships, but it needs to be done in a way that's empowering to the local communities. So in our community organizing, we have 70 plus congregations. They come from all parts of the city and some from the suburbs. But there's a bias built into how we determine our issues, and it's the west side and south side are the poor communities. And so while we do listening campaigns in all of our communities, it's those communities that have, because that's where we want to make the biggest difference with our mission being racial and economic justice. But what we also need partners in these other communities, because they can reach to their legislators who are also going to be part of this decision-making process at the bigger level. So it's kind of a mix, and then I also think you need people focused on community development, because you also need to be developing communities. You can't just be the political battle. You need to be restoring communities. But Detroit is, you know, such a challenging example, because you had such massive flight. I mean, business flight, every kind of flight. And then you just have blocks upon blocks just waiting to be redeveloped or to be gentrified or to be whatever. And, you know, where you, as I understand it, large swaths of places where even the street lights are not working and stuff. And so they're not appealing places for people to move in and be a part of that. So, but if you can get a few places where you begin to see this happen, it is hope. I know one of the things they've done is invited artists in to, you know, give a house for $1 and come and fix it and live in it. And again, if that can be the first phase of something positive rather than the first phase of just the next gentrification move, which artists oftentimes kind of get used in the process. They come in because this is where they can afford to live. They're aspiring artists, but there are also a lot of times white folks who come in, and then it's appealing for other whites. So it's an interest. So these are, and I think your question is very well taken. These are massive, big structural issues that are going to take a long time to address. But it's also changing the way we think about it and what we think is appropriate, what we think is moral, and arguing sort of that campaign too.
Well, thinking about the idea of community and also church, because these are communities, they are in the community.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that regardless of geography or race or class is the narrative. It's
Mhm.
like if Christianity is selling this narrative of success,
Mhm.
it doesn't
Right.
matter where you live,
Right,
instead of solidarity. So
Yeah.
for me, has to do with the core message.
yeah, right, exactly. So gentrification fits right nicely with the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, right. Obviously, if you've been watching the press lately, the most egregious example of that is Pastor Creflo Dollar, who needs a new jet at $65 million that he's trying to raise. But you know, that kind of mentality is very much a part of our materialistic culture. Yeah, yes.
I don't have the answer, but I bring it up because
Yeah.
I think it's relevant to this context in the Boston area.
Right,
I think of public transportation, for example.
right,
And what happens to a place where, when you open a new, let's say a new commuter rail stop, or you open a new, a T-line stop.
mhm,
Now, many of us know that, it's either you have an apartment and you rent a train. I mean, a lot of us can't afford to have a car and
Right.
apartment's not gonna happen. So many of us know the benefits of having,
mhm,
public transportation.
mhm.
But also seeing the history of the area, for example, in Newburyport, some other places, when you open a commuter rail line, or you open a T-line stop, I'm thinking, for example, in the future in Somerville, we know what can happen, so, and that's coming, there's plans, so we know I think Somerville's gonna happen in 2016, 2017, I think it is. So we know it's gonna happen. So when you know that it's coming, when you know
Mhm.
that train stop's gonna open,
Right.
how do you prepare for that?
Mhm.
I mean, because you know it's coming. I mean,
Right.
there is no some factors. No, you know it's this is being telegraphed. It's going to
Right.
happen. So how do you prepare for that?
So, I think you also need to be very realistic and understand that developers knew that before you knew it, okay? So they're already a step ahead
Okay.
in coming in, and, because that's a part of how you gentrify areas, is you start to put the infrastructure in place. And then developers are already in mind and already maybe even have signed deals. So what you have to figure out is how to expose that reality. And then encourage local, because local communities can still change some of that. They can still battle. We had where I've just moved from, but in St. Paul, they built a subway line, and initially to connect both downtowns, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And initially, it sort of looked like it was going to affect businesses in these poor communities because they'd be without any kind of because they had to close basically while this was coming through or stocking them out. So and then they had just certain stops that was going to jump over some of the roughest areas, most impoverished areas, and just hit the areas that had potential for gentrification. So local residents said, first off, you've got to make all these other stops so that it actually serves our community. It doesn't just serve the communities either you have in mind or the ones that already exist. And second, then you got to help us stay in business, local, stores and communities while you're doing this. And so that was fought by community organizations with the politicians that then, eventually the developers have to do. One of the vehicles that you can use, and maybe this has been used in Boston, we're just experimenting with it now in Chicago, is what's called a community benefits agreement. I know New York has used this a lot, I think, as well. And so where we're using it is on the west side of Chicago, again, one of the poor areas. They're building this magnificent medical district that's going to have hotels, housing. It's going to create a lot of jobs. And so the idea is we want to make sure local community residents get jobs that pay living wages, and that some of the housing will be set aside for local folks as well. Now, developers don't have any interest in that. So then you have to advocate, you have to get the local politicians on your side, and then you build a case, and so the local politicians will say, well, we're not going to give you what you need in the way of, drawing a blank on the word, but what you need to be able to do business in this area.
Like permits?
Permits, thank you. See, when you're 57, sometimes the word you want, you're trying to grab. So they can hold back permits. So what happens is community organizations and developers sign an agreement that's legally binding called a community benefits agreement. And they will say in that, if you can move, and you have to pressure them to do this, that we will create this many jobs will be guaranteed. And if it doesn't happen, then you can take them to court. But you've got to then rally, you've got to have community organizers and policy folks working on this, and you've got to have the politicians in the community, and the council members or aldermen, the state senator or representative or whoever's representing that area to side with you, and then be willing to stand up against very wealthy developers who are often probably contributing to their campaigns. So, but so you're thinking ahead. So you're going, okay, we see this is coming, we know it's coming, we know alongside it. So who do we need to talk to, who do we need to put pressure on, and who do we need to hold accountable? And again, if it's a faith community, then you say you also define the narrative and say this is a moral issue, that people deserve jobs in this community. You're coming into our community, and so you've got to also be a part of helping our community develop for people that are here. So that's the kind but if you have that notice, and that's one of the signs, the transportation system is now being set up for the next wave of development. And like I said, development in itself is not bad. It's how it affects people and who gets included in it. Because we want communities that are underserved or have been ignored to be redeveloped. So, man. All right, so you're going to wind us up with this one.
Lupe Fiasco, he writes, in his new album, there's a song called Deliver. And it talks about how the pizza man won't come and deliver in your hood because of the violence and that kind of stuff. And then when the 2 police officers were shot in Bed-Stuy, one of the comments from one of the residents was, these police aren't here for us. They're here to protect the gentrified, the people who are gentrifying the community. So the question is, it seems like we know that there are systems that have set in place the systemic violence in urban neighborhoods, and it seems like gentrification is amplifying police presence in these areas, outpacing the community's ability to deal with its own issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, how can there be a multi-ethnic or multiracial community when gentrifying is outpacing the community's ability to deal with its own violence, etc.
Well, that's the huge structural reality that we deal with, and that these various structures intersect. So, in the kind of classic model of gentrification, you just let the community die. You let all this crime and stuff reign, and pretty soon you just almost empty out the community in the kind of classic kind of thinking about gentrification. Then you kind of bring the new people in, and there's no attempt. So obviously, what your suggestion would say is there's some other realities that need to be addressed in this. And one is safety for everyone. One is, policing that is just and equitable. And so now what we're really talking about is this whole large system of what it means to be a city, and you can't address one without addressing the other. But you're right, gentrifying communities have all kinds of policing to protect their citizens from the next door neighborhood that's not yet gentrified, and who might even be a little mad about what's going on in the kind of treatment. So I live in Hyde Park now, Chicago, which is a community that you could classify as a gentrifying community. It has a kind of a weird history because it was in South Chicago, which is where the only place that black people could live initially when they migrated to Chicago. Then they created space on the west side. In this huge black community, there's this white community right in the middle, historically. And University of Chicago, exactly. You've named the reason why. And initially in the early 1900s, that was done through restrictive covenants. So you had, on your deed that you could only sell this house to a white person. And so they protected the white properties. And then, of course, civil rights movement came, and that wasn't allowed. And then a lot of African Americans moved into Hyde Park. It actually became 70% black at one point. And then University of Chicago just could not have this many black people nearby where their students were, because they're at the southern tip of this neighborhood in Hyde Park. So they served as a developer. University of Chicago bought up large pieces of property and basically changed the economic reality. So there's still a lot of African Americans in the community, but they're middle class and upper class. And there's still some mix. I live right on the northern edge, which is the blacker side, because it's farther away from Chicago. 2 blocks from President Obama's house, and 2 blocks from Minister Farrakhan's house, so it makes it an interesting kind of neighborhood mix. But but again, and we're seeing we have present policing all the time, and it's Chicago PD and the University of Chicago's police that are working in tandem. And then, of course, up by Obama, you got Secret Service too. If you, so I live in one of the safest corners in the entire city of Chicago, because we've got 2 police forces and the Secret Service and the Fruit of Islam from the Nation of Islam. So we have very interesting. But it's that reality of policing here, but not being concerned about safety and addressing the core issues of violence in this community. So yeah, that's you're right. The whole. This stuff happens fast, and all at once you wake up and your neighborhood has changed. And so if you see the signs, that's when you want to move. I'm sure there's a nice Bible verse about the signs of the times that apply to that. So thank you for this opportunity to have a conversation, talk about these issues. The author has to put in a plug for his book. So the book that we talked, I co-wrote a book with Alan Busak, who is a theologian from South Africa, an anti-apartheid activist. It's called Radical Reconciliation. We use the term radical about how do you get at the roots of injustice to actually do the work of reconciliation, because it's injustice that's creating the need for reconciliation. And it's on Orbis Press. So some of what I've talked about, this sort of post-colonial perspective on reconciliation, you can find here. And then Alan has just some wonderful chapters in here. He's just an amazing theologian. So we kind of alternate chapters. We take kind of the same theme, but he gives sort of South African, I give sort of the U.S. perspective. And we start with the biblical material and then move more into the sort of the country-specific examples. But so I think it's something to enjoy. And if you've never, chapter 2, which is, I write chapter 1 on sort of the definitions of reconciliation. Chapter 2, Alan's first chapter in the book, takes the story of a woman named Rizpah. And if you've not heard of her, it's worth reading the chapter all by itself about this amazing voice from a reconciliation from the kind of the prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Scriptures. So I recommend the book just even for just his chapter on Rizpah, because it just amazed me when I read it. So thanks again. Thanks, Mr. Drew.